Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I can't remember who it was who said, having heard myself introduced, I can't wait to hear myself speak, and that's rather how I feel standing in front of you tonight. Let me thank Lars, CEO of the President's Institute. Let me thank our sponsor, Deloitte, and everyone here for that warm welcome. And it's great to be back in Copenhagen. When I heard about the name of this event, it brought back a few memories. Because I've been to a lot of summits with presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, premiers, other heads of government too. All those G8s, G20s, United Nations assemblies, NATO conferences, Commonwealth meetings. Sometimes they went on for hours and hours, well into the small hours. And we all had different ways of getting through them. But I'll never forget the advice of one leader as we sat around the European Council table very late at night. It was Silvio Berlusconi. He turned on his microphone and said, "Frankly, if meetings are going to go on this long, I advise all of you to do what I have done and take a mistress in Brussels." Unbelievable. He's still going. We meet at this President's Summit at what I believe are doubly dangerous times. There are dangerous trends, Islamist extremism sweeping across the globe, more people on the move seeking refuge than at any time since the Second World War, Iran still boasting its nuclear ambitions, climate change perhaps threatening our very existence, and the aftermath of a financial crash whose effects are reaching far into this century. And on top of that are the dangerous reactions to those trends. People calling into question open economies and free markets. People saying multilateral organizations and agreements should be scrapped. Offering alternatives to the liberal democratic system that I believe has served the world so well. We've seen it with the success of populist parties across Europe. It played a part in Britain backing Brexit, and in America choosing Donald Trump. He promptly scrapped the Iran deal, pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, and launched a trade war with China. Suddenly, Berlusconi perhaps doesn't look such a maverick after all. But I guess the question here, everyone is asking, how do we, politician, business person, anyone, how do we lead in such dangerous times? I have some experience of taking power in an era of uncertainty. Back in 2010, I entered Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister. It seems like a long time ago now. Indeed, my youngest daughter, Florence, who was actually born while we lived in Downing Street, who knew no other life for the first 6 years of her life, actually asked me on the school run the other day, "Daddy, is it true, were you really the Prime Minister?" I was, and I remember the first day very clearly. Climbing that famous staircase, lined by pictures of those who came before me, and realizing the financial situation that I was inheriting was worse than any of them had faced. We had the biggest budget deficit in our peacetime history. Our country was spending more on servicing our debts than on our defenses. Our predecessors even left a note on the desk of a Treasury Minister simply saying, "There's no more money left." The dangers were very clear. Stagnation, high unemployment, terrible memories of going cap in hand to the IMF in the 1970s. And the lessons I learned then, I believe, offer some lessons for the situation the world finds itself in today. First, I learned the importance of working across political divides in difficult times. There was a choice in those days after Britain elected a hung parliament. We could have gone it alone and tried to form a minority government. We could have gone back into opposition, let Labour limp on for a little longer before having another election. Or we could try to join forces with a smaller opposition party, forming the first coalition government in the United Kingdom for 70 years. And that is what I chose to do, to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to a party that had just been our opponents just days before, to ask my former sparring partner, Nick Clegg, to become my partner in government. Commentators said that our coalition government wouldn't last 5 minutes. It lasted the full 5 years. It gave us unity at a time of discord, stability at a time of uncertainty. And it was quite popular. People liked that we were working together. But above all, it gave us a platform to do what needed to be done, which is the second lesson. Don't duck the tough decisions. I was adamant we would do the difficult things to get our economy back into the black. We reduced government to its smallest size since the Second World War. We cut spending in every department except health, education, and help for the poorest. We liberated the private sector by cutting taxes, reducing regulation, and backing science. We stuck to the mantra that tough medicine, if taken properly, can work. And the result? The deficit down by 2/3, 1 million more businesses, record employment, nearly 3 million new jobs, more than the rest of the European Union put together. Now, of course, it was all relative. I remember telling Barack Obama that Britain and America were the two fastest growing economies in the G7. And he just looked at me and said, "Yes, David, we are the two best looking horses in the glue factory." Now, people said, you can't take the difficult decisions and be re-elected. But after coalition, we went and won the first Conservative majority since 1992. In fact, you had to go back to 1885 to find a prime minister who'd won more votes and more seats after serving a full term. Now, the next thing people say about these polarized times is that you have to make your choice. Go to the right or head to the left. Be on the side of business and markets or care about the planet. Fight the culture wars or stand up for minority rights. Cut deficits or care about the poorest. I've always thought that approach is nonsense. Over 6 years in government, we proved these people wrong. We cut our deficit, but we also cut carbon emissions. We backed families in the tax system, but we also legalized same-sex marriage, the first conservative-led government anywhere in the world to choose to take on that reform, something I'm very proud of. We reduced welfare spending, yes, but we also reduced inequality and poverty. We committed 2% of national spending to defense, but we also met our target of 0.7% of our income on international aid, the first major advanced country to do so. As people see the dangers of these times and flee to the extremes, I maintain that if you make real choices, the center in politics is often the hardest and most radical place to be. And if we want to deal with the things that are fueling populism, fears over immigration, over the costs of globalization, we should remember that. We can control immigration and being open, welcoming, multiracial nations. We can advocate free trade and at the same time promote the strength of our own economies. And that is the third lesson I learned. It doesn't have to be a choice between the extremes. You can choose to take bold actions across the board. But of course, we do have to listen. And that is the fourth lesson. The only way to ward off populists and extremists is to heed some of the things that are being said. Their answers might be wrong, but they are right that there are grievances. Take the economy. A rising tide did not lift all boats. Rewards at the top certainly accelerated, but for too long, wages at the bottom were stagnant. That's why we introduced a $10 minimum wage, where we took 4 million of the poorest people out of paying income tax altogether. But it is clear today in all our countries, we need to do much, much more. If we want to save the free market, free enterprise system, we need to reform it. The parties of the center and the center-right must do that, or parties of the hard left will destroy it. But the grievances aren't just economic. They are cultural. People are feeling left behind sometimes by the pace of change. Immigration is the biggest political issue in just about every European Union country. And that should be no surprise. It is no good railing against the judgment of ordinary people. They are right. It has been too high for too long, and too little has been done to demonstrate that governments are dealing with it fairly and have it under control. The EU's approach, in my opinion, has been disastrous. You can't take down internal borders between countries. if you don't have strong external borders. And you can't say to vulnerable refugees, you can all come, if there is not a plan to integrate people and strong backing from your country to do so. We won't defeat populism unless we deal with its causes, reform capitalism, control immigration, recognize that nation states haven't had their day. They are still the political unit that people actually identify with and consent to be governed by. My decision to hold a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU was linked to that view. I always supported membership of the EU because of the benefits of trading with our neighbors, engaging with our partners, cooperating, working together. But like so many people, I never liked the idea of political union. To be honest, we didn't really like the EU flag. We rather preferred our own. We didn't much like the EU Parliament. We have our own, it's been around for almost 1,000 years. And that unease got worse over the years as the organization became too big, too bossy, too interfering. By 2013, the EU was nothing like the European Economic Community that we joined in 1973. Consent for our membership was becoming wafer thin. I sat through those EU Council meetings and I saw it happening. Not just these political or cultural problems, but a growing danger that countries inside the Eurozone were starting to make decisions alone that affected all EU members. And I strongly believe the only effective way to deal with all these issues was to seek reform through renegotiation. And ultimately, a decision of that magnitude should only be decided directly by the people. And in the end, people decided to leave. I wish we had taken the other path. I haven't changed my mind about that. But you can't argue, I don't think, that for the 5th biggest economy in the world to decide that it wants to be a friend, a neighbor, and a partner to the European Union, but not a member, is somehow an illegitimate path. Perhaps in future, instead of being in the EU, but out of the bits we didn't much like the single currency, we'll be out of the EU, but hopefully taking part in the things that we need, such as a strong trading relationship and vital cooperation over security. Hopefully, we'll be contented and cooperative neighbors rather than perhaps reluctant tenants. We'll see. Whatever path we take, we must not ignore these causes of populism. Witnessing legitimate concerns about immigration, but doing nothing. Undergoing years of massive youth unemployment and stagnation in some Eurozone countries and looking the other way. Seeing the powers of these organizations like the EU grow and grow and never consulting your people. Because when legitimate grievances are ignored, that is when people turn to the so-called strongmen who actually threaten to break the global system apart. And it all comes back to democracy. And let me end with this, my 5th and final lesson, which is about holding fast to our values. All around the world, we see these so-called strongmen leaders, Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, trying to take shortcuts to success. They hold elections, but they ditch the accountability. They talk up the rule of law, but they appoint their own guardians. They say they have free speech, but they silence their opponents and hobble their press. They boast about free markets, but they rig them with protectionism. Theirs is a knockoff democracy. It may look like the real thing, but look closer and it's missing all the vital building blocks of democracy. The free press, the rule of law, the rights, the opportunities, the scrutiny. Believe me, being quizzed once a week by your members of parliament at Prime Minister's Questions was something I used to dread. When I traveled around the world, I did see how others respected the accountability. I remember once walking through New York City with the mayor, Mike Bloomberg. Everyone was coming up to him saying, "Mike, you're doing a great job, you're a fantastic mayor." No one had a clue who I was. Till eventually someone pointed from across the street and said, "Hey, Cameron, Prime Minister's Questions, we love your show." But there's a serious point, which is democracy is not what happens every 4 or 5 years at the ballot box. It's what happens every day when we enforce our values and our laws. I'll never forget one conversation I had about these building blocks of democracy. It was just before I became Prime Minister when I met with Margaret Thatcher. She was becoming frail and ill, but the light of her intellect still burnt very bright. And she fixed me with that terrifying glare that she had, gripped my hand, and said, remember, there's only one thing that matters, only one thing. Liberty under the rule of law. Nothing else matters. And the longer I was Prime Minister, the more I think I understood what she meant. Of course elections matter. Of course orderly changes of government matter. Getting rid of tyrants or corrupt governments, that matters. But what actually separates good, decent, fair, democratic societies from the rest is freedom under the rule of law. The fact that actions taken by our governments can be struck down in court. It can be maddening, but upon it our true freedom depends. It is what marks us out. The strongmen leaders of this world today claim getting re-elected means their countries are free. No, it doesn't. It is those building blocks that make a country free, that make it a real democracy. Now, people claim that in these dangerous times, we can suspend such fundamentals. We cannot. Others say we can ignore the grievances and carry on regardless. We should not. Some argue we cannot get re-elected after taking tough decisions. We can. We did. There's a Chinese proverb: the person who says something is impossible should not interrupt the person who is doing it. Keeping focused, keeping cool heads, not being lured by the extremes, that is the way the world will recover from these difficult and dangerous times. And everyone, including business, can play a big part in that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
David, good to see you, and thank you very much for your passionate keynote. And we all loved your energy, and I hope we can keep it like that.
Lovely to be here.
You're more than welcome, of course. This is about breaking barriers.
Yeah.
And we're talking business. You're talking about how the world looks like and how it's gonna look like. But I would like to go first to you actually, my first questions are more on a personal note. At President's Institute, we always tell our members to observe, diagnose, and learn from the best. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we have that opportunity. Chatham rules apply, so you can speak frankly. So what can we learn from you on a more personal level? And my first question is basically, what makes you stand out? How do you win? How do you create success? In short, what's your X factor? Can you elaborate?
Well, it's always very difficult to answer that yourself. I mean, I think I'm not one of these people who believes in the theory of the incredible, indomitable, unbeatable leader. To me, it's all about the team. I don't think you can do the job of being an effective Prime Minister without having not just a great team of cabinet ministers. Everyone always say they've got them. You have to have a team. You know in business, a meeting with more than 5 or 6 people in the room, you can't really always say exactly what you want. You need to have your closest colleagues are people that you will do anything for, and they will do anything for you. I was very lucky in that I had the same Home Secretary for 6 years. She's now the Prime Minister. I had the same Chancellor. He was Shadow Chancellor for 5 years and then Chancellor for 6 years. I almost had the same Foreign Secretary for the whole time I was Prime Minister. We had a very strong team. So my 3 T's, if you like, would be team, time, and temperament. Team is obvious. Temperament, I think, is quite obvious. If you're in a leadership role, you have to be able to take bad news. You have to be able to handle unbelievable pressure and difficult moments with calmness, because if you don't, others around you will panic, no matter how panicked you're feeling on the inside. I think the difficult one today is time. I tell this story because I think it brings it home in a way that is relevant to business. Think of my country. The proudest moment in our history, May 1940, when we made that decision to fight on against Hitler. And I used to take people into the cabinet room in number 10, and I used to say, this is where Winston Churchill sat, in that chair, And with his colleagues, they made this unbelievably brave decision. The rest of Europe has fallen, we're all on our own, and we decide to fight on. What a great decision. And then I used to say to them, and remember, they talked about this decision for 5 days. Imagine that today. After about 10 minutes, you know, the press secretary would knock on the door and say, I've got Sky News outside. They want to know, are we fighting on or are we surrendering? After about an hour, probably less, someone from within the meeting would start tweeting, you know, not looking very good in here, hashtag let's throw in the towel. But it's a frivolous way of making a serious point, which is the one thing we don't have in politics or in business or in running a great charity or great organization. You don't have time, and you have to find time. Because the truth is, we'll all make bad decisions if we don't have time to think and to game through all the options, really think through what we think. And so I think one of the things that everyone can do in their busy lives is think, for these really big decisions, I've got to carve out time. I've got to make time. Because the truth is, when you look back at a political career or a business career, you don't remember the day-to-day stuff. Every day in my job, you were dealing with resignations and crises, and this minister's been found in bed with a whatever. You know, you can't remember any of it when you look back. You don't remember any of it. You do remember the big decisions. And your regret is normally that you didn't make more of the big decisions and that you didn't give yourself all the time to think that through. So time, team, and temperament would be my tips. But like all leaders, particularly ones that got into it so young, there's a lot of things you learn along the way.
But if you need to manage all that, how do you personally manage your own energy level to wrap your arms around all these challenges? Because to me, that is always the differentiator, to have high energy. I even think that on high energy, my quality of thinking goes up. On
Yes.
low energy, my quality of thinking goes down. So
I think that's true. And I think, look, I mean, I tried to stay relatively fit. I tried to get a good night's sleep. I'd often go to bed really quite early. I was at my desk, actually normally at the kitchen table with my red boxes at 5:30, 5:45 in the morning, because I thought you've got to get the 2 hours reading in before anyone else is holding meetings so you're properly briefed for the day. And I'd sometimes be in bed so early that I could hear Nick Robinson from the BBC doing his two-way interview outside in Downing Street. I wanted to lift open the window. Can you shut up? Someone's trying to get asleep here, you know. You've got to give yourself time. You know, you'll make bad decisions if you are stressed, if you're tired, if you're run ragged. And so the time you spend thinking with your team about your diary, your calendar, you start with thinking, I cannot believe I'm having to spend so much time thinking about these things. But it's time very well spent. Because you've got to, if you think about it, it's the same as being a chief executive. You don't go to a meeting that you're not chairing, ever, as prime minister. You know, really, apart from international gatherings, at home, any meeting you're in, you are running the agenda, chairing the meeting, making the decisions, doing the summing up, deciding what happens next. And to do that, you've got to be totally on top of everything, not only having read everything, but you've got to be alert and refreshed.
Great. Thanks for being so open and coming to that. I think we would like to know also from you, if you could pick and maybe share with us one of your finest moments in life. What would that be? If you now just sit back for a second and think, okay, now, what was like really great?
Well, in politics, I mean, obviously in life, there are the most important things, the birth of your first child and that moment when, you know, you've walked, your wife-to-be's walked up the aisle and you think, that's it, she hasn't decided against it, she's going through with it. You know, those are the really important moments. In politics, I think, you know, there's something about the first time you walk into Downing Street as Prime Minister. And I think the 2010 election which ended with this result. We were the largest party, but there were 5 days of confusion about what would happen, which actually in European terms is pretty good. I mean, Belgium once went for, I think, half a year without a government. We hadn't done coalitions since Churchill, so we thought you had to do it very quickly, and we did. There's something about walking in the first time, and you get sort of clapped in. It's a small building, as you know, and you sit at your desk, and the first thing that happens is they hand you a telephone, and it's Obama on the phone, who I knew a bit, and he said, well done, David. He said, enjoy this moment. It's all downhill from here. broadly speaking, he was right, but it was, I used that line with other people when I congratulated them. So that was a pretty fine moment.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Just before you came on stage, you said, Eric, give me hell later on. I'm gonna go there right now because, of course, after asking you what is your finest moments in life, could you also share one of your most defining moments in life, where the odds are against you, where there seems no way out, and where you're in that struggle, and where everything seems lost, and then what?
They're often, you know, this is true in business as in politics, that so many times the decision you're taking is not a brilliant outcome versus a terrible outcome. So many occasions you're dealing with the least bad of a range of difficult outcomes. And the stress involved in thinking those through and trying to understand what you're confronting, though that leads to very many bad moments. I think all prime ministers would say that the most difficult thing is when you have troops engaged in wars overseas and you're losing people. And you know, the Danish troops and the British troops served absolutely next door to each other with some Estonian troops as well in Helmand province in Afghanistan, and we lost many, many people, as Denmark did. And there's nothing more painful than that. And knowing that you believe you're doing the right thing, and I think it was right to try and give that country a chance of stability after the Taliban and its hosting of Al-Qaeda. But you know, every casualty you feel very personally because you know you are responsible for them being there. And I think that's the most difficult thing. But we have to find a way. Again, we can't get into a world where politicians aren't prepared to take difficult decisions and we just put up the drawbridge and say we're not going to take part in these things anymore. I think when we look at the world today, there is no walk-on-by option against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the rest of it. You know, the idea that you can opt out of this fight. They have declared war on us. They hate our values, they hate our system, they hate our societies. They want to kill us in huge numbers. You've seen that in Manchester, in the Bataclan. You've seen it all across Europe. You can't opt out of this. So we need to allow our politicians to make difficult decisions, to send people sometimes into harm's way. But it's easily the most painful and difficult thing for them to do.
Thank you. As a former infantry officer, I'm very happy with your remark here. I think we pay tribute to these guys. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Another quick question. Like me, you're also a father and a husband. How do you manage with your
Well,
busy
I have an amazing wife who I always say that if she had organized the logistics of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, he would have got to Moscow. He probably would have got to Vladivostok. I mean, she is absolutely, she runs I'm now the torch has passed. She's running a fashion business that she set up herself, actually in Downing Street. And I sent her a text today, actually, from Copenhagen, because I noticed that Melania Trump was wearing one of her dresses as she got onto her airplane to go to Africa. And so I've now had to change my line about Trump completely. I mean, I used to say this is a terrible presidency. Now, you know, so much winning, you know, so I've had to change my line. But she was brilliant at organizing life for me and the children so that it was possible, I think, to be prime minister and a reasonable husband and a reasonable father. It can be done, but it takes a lot of organization.
I can imagine. Okay. Let's talk business a little bit now.
Yeah.
Of course, Brexit is on our minds, and mainland Europe, we're lost a little bit what's going on in the UK now. Last year we had Nigel Farage speaking at this summit, and he told us Brexit would in the end be a positive thing. Well, we haven't come to that stage yet. In Europe, we were all shocked when the UK voted against Europe, and you were shocked as well, weren't you?
Yes, I think,
yeah.
Look, the way I look back at it, and I think we had some very strong arguments for staying in, and I wish we had stayed in. We had the arguments about the importance of the single market, the importance of the economy, the importance of jobs, and those arguments are incredibly strong. I think that the difficulty we had was that, as I said in my speech, British people, perhaps a little bit like Denmark, we see the utility of the European Union, but we struggled ever, I think, to sort of fall in love with the institutions. We have such a proud sort of parliamentary democracy ourselves, that the political union part of it we found hard. And so in the referendum campaign, I think it ended up with some very rational arguments for staying, but these quite strong emotional arguments about control over laws and control over borders and on the other side. And I think that those emotional arguments were powerful, and that's why my side lost, which, it's frustrating to me because, I know Europe values the four freedoms, the movement of goods and people and services and capital. But in my view, they shouldn't be immutable. The European Union should be a club of cooperating countries that try and find ways to deal with different countries' differences. And in this case, we weren't able to do that. Now, what happens now, it is a complicated picture. It's going to be a very complicated few months. I mean, broadly speaking, there's 5 outcomes. We could leave with a deal, which I still think is the most likely outcome. We could fail to agree and leave without a deal, which I think would be very difficult and I hope doesn't happen. We can have a breakdown in Parliament because Parliament doesn't agree what should happen. And in those circumstances, there could be a general election. I think unlikely because we now have a fixed-term Parliament system. There could be such a breakdown that it leads to calls for a second referendum. Parliament can't decide this, let's put it back to the people. Or conceivably, fifth option, there could be an extension of Article 50, take longer over the process, either as the government tries to work out a solution with the European Union. I think the most likely, so I think I owe it to you to try and give you my forecast of what I think will happen. I think the most likely is that a deal will be constructed. My fear is that the way it'll be constructed and the way it'll get through is by making it relatively vague. That the withdrawal treaty will be there, about the rights of European citizens, the money that needs to be paid, and all the rest of it, and the transitional period, but will be rather vague about the future, a so-called blind Brexit. And I think the problem with that is that, business and people and everybody wants to know with some certainty, how do we work this in the future? And so my hope is that we get some clarity. I think that the safest thing, if you're leaving the EU, to try and leave safely without too much disruption, is to stay as close as you can to the European Union. Stay close on trade, stay close on rules, stay close on alignment, because, we don't want to see the economic disruption and problems that there could be from a harder Brexit. So that would be, I'm trying to give you as accurate a picture as I can, but frankly, it's a very uncertain situation because in the end, the British Constitution is just 8 words. What the Queen decides in Parliament is law. So Parliament can make its own mind up in the end. We don't have a written constitution. Parliament can decide, yes, we back this deal. No, we don't back that deal. Yes, we're content with a hard Brexit. No, we're not content with a hard Brexit. Parliament can decide. So anyone who tells you with any certainty what's going to happen is wrong.
I understand. Thanks for sharing and giving us your view here. Rook, a quick question. Go back in time 2 years. If you would look at this Brexit referendum with today's knowledge, what would you have done differently?
It's a very good question, and I am writing a biography where I'll answer all these questions. It will be available in all good bookshops, and I hope available in... Churchill once said, history will be kind to me because I'm going to write the first draft, and I think he had a good theory there. Look, I mean, there are 4, should we have had a referendum? Did we do the right renegotiation? Did we fight the right campaign? Did we pick the right time? And if I answer yes to all those questions, it's not going to be a very thoughtful memoir. I think obviously I've been over this in my head so many times because I worry so much about what the outcome will be. The reason for having the referendum, I still think, was right because you can't have treaty after treaty, change after change, power after power transferring from Britain to Brussels and never asking the people who are ultimately sovereign about whether that should be done. I mean, here we are in Denmark, after all, the original home of the European referendum over... I remember the Maastricht referendum. I remember thinking jealously that you were given a say over this big change, which we in the United Kingdom were not. And, arguably if Britain and Denmark had both voted against the Maastricht Treaty, Maybe we would now be living in a more intergovernmental, more cooperative Europe without charging into the single currency, which I think, frankly, has still got huge issues and problems. But there we are. So my view was we needed to settle this problem. And there was a problem. People sometimes say to me, yes, there was a problem in the Conservative Party. And I don't deny, of course, my party has a very strong Brexit wing. But there was a real problem. If I take you back to December 2011, when there was a treaty suggested for the Eurozone, but which all of Europe was going to have to sign up to, I was not satisfied that this had safeguards for Britain about our membership of the single market, how it would impact financial services in London. I didn't get those safeguards, so I said, well, as these things are decided by unanimity, I'm going to veto this treaty. What actually happened next was that the other European countries went ahead and passed that treaty, using the same buildings, using the same people, using the same table that we were sat around. And that brought home to me that there was a deep instability in the relationship and the way it was working. We needed to deal with that. We needed to confirm Britain's place in the single market, out of the single currency, not in the political union, and we needed changes over things like the rights of people to come and live and work and claim benefits in Britain. And if we could do that, we could settle Britain's future within the European Union for the future. And I still think if I hadn't had a referendum, the demands would have grown and grown. Another leader would have had a referendum in the future. This problem needed to be dealt with. I'm just, sad and disappointed we couldn't solve it in a way that kept Britain in with these exceptions and special measures, many of which Denmark has often itself found necessary in order to keep what is another proud independent nation inside the European Union. So I think that was the right decision, but obviously the timing of the referendum, the renegotiation, the way we fought the campaign, you look back and you always think there were weapons I could have used that I didn't use, there were arguments we could have made. Who knows whether they would have been decisive? But I'm a very reflective person. I don't just sit back and think, well, we got it all right, we just got the wrong result. You have to think, what could we have done differently? But in the end, as I say, this was a problem that was a real problem, not simply a political problem. There was a real problem that Britain had, being a very large country in the European Union, not in the single currency. And as the single currency became more and more of a drive towards integration, we were going to have to settle this problem one way or the other.
Thanks for elaborating on that. Real quick, you brought up Winston Churchill. Now, when I look at television, I see Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, then sometimes I think, what would Winston Churchill think of all this? Because, man,
well,
what do you think?
Churchill actually is quoted by both sides of the European debate in Britain, because, of course, he spoke about a United States of Europe. And when you read his speeches, it's quite difficult to determine exactly what he thought. Did he want Britain in this organization, or did he think Britain, with its relations with the Commonwealth, would have the relationship of a neighbor of the United States of Europe? One of the greatest Churchill scholars is a friend of mine, Andrew Roberts, who's just brought out a very good one-volume biography of Churchill. And he passionately believes that Churchill wanted to see Europe unify, but with Britain as a partner rather than a member. We'll never know. I think the truth is that for Britain, of course, we have wider relationships around the world. Of course, we have this special relationship and this tie of language and history and culture with the United States and Canada. And the rest of it. But, we are a European power. And what all prime ministers have tried to do is keep Britain in the European Union, but with a special status. Not in the single currency, staying out of the justice and home affairs, not joining the Schengen no borders agreement. We were always the difficult ones. But what we needed to do was keep maintaining that special status. And the European Union never liked that very much. But actually it was the answer, and I suspect still is the answer, for how you have a Britain that is both globally engaged but also recognizing its geography. I mean, that's my great argument with the Brexiteers is always, look, just when you leave the European Union, it doesn't mean it ceases to exist. It is still your biggest trading partner. It's still your neighbor. These are still your colleagues, your friends. These are still your security partners. And so some of the arguments about Brexit almost assumed that the issue of Britain's relationship with the European Union would be solved simply by leaving. And we're discovering now that's not the case.
I think enough on Brexit and UK. Let's take a wider look at what's going on in the world. In the previous century, I served my country as an infantry officer and helped winning the Cold War. Never fired a single shot, but
Stationed in Berlin, or?
not stationed in Berlin, a little bit more to the west.
Right.
Yeah. As we speak, my son is joining the Dutch Marine Corps as an officer as well. Should I be worried? Is there another new Cold War starting between Russia and Western Europe?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad your son is giving such great service, because we're going to need strong military, strong intelligence. We're going to need the hard power as well as the soft power. I think to answer your question very directly, I think what we see with Russia is, they very clearly want to push and push at restoring what they see as their near abroad to their sphere of influence. And our only response to that should be one of great toughness. I take a very simple view about this. We saw what happened when effectively Russia invaded Georgia and hacked off 2 parts of it that are effectively now satellites of Russia. The international response was a fuss for a while, but really no long-term consequences, no long-term sanctions, no long-term pressure. And the lesson Putin drew from that is that I can get away with, when an opportunity arises, taking territory and holding influence. And that's why what happened in Ukraine happened. Now, the response to Ukraine, many people see as rather weak and not effective. I don't agree at all. Actually, we had very tough sanctions coordinated between the United States and the European Union. We supported the Ukrainian military. We supported the Ukrainian government. And actually, I think we have demonstrated that Europe will, and America and NATO will take very tough action to stop this tendency of Russia. But I think we can't pretend it isn't happening. So I think the difficulty that your son and others in our military are going to face is that we've got 2 very big tasks at the same time. We must show a very tough response to Russian aggression. We need to station troops, including Dutch or British or Danish troops, in the Baltic states, in Poland. It's very important when they look across those borders, they don't just see Latvian troops or Polish troops, they see Dutch troops and British troops and Danish troops and American troops. We've got to do that, but at the same time, we've got to recognize this global struggle we're engaged in with extremist Islam, which is either occupying countries or trying to turn over countries and then exporting terror to our own countries is another huge challenge. And so we need to try and fight both these battles at the same time, and that's going to require higher military expenditure, but also a lot of expenditure on intelligence and information and mobility. That is going to be one of the fights of our times.
Okay, good. We come back a little bit later on NATO, and I would like to have your opinion there as well. Let's go a bit more south from Russia, Turkey. 70 million consumers, crossroads of Europe, Middle East, an important NATO partner. Today's leadership, Mr. Erdogan, what stance do we need to take here?
Well, I think this is a really difficult one. I was very much convinced by the arguments when I was leader of the opposition that Turkey was such a key partner for the European Union and for countries like Britain because here was a Muslim country that was democracy, that had Western leanings, had a market economy, that if we could only try and anchor this country more in that direction, it would help us so much with the other regional problems in the Middle East. And I think that was right to try that, but I think we have to be honest, it's not been going very well. That Erdogan's approach seems to be to actually have a steady Islamization of his society and democracy, to progressively restrict the space for free speech and the free press, to strengthen his powers as president rather than to have some of the things I was talking about in my speech. But I suspect the answer is we mustn't give up. Maybe we need to adopt a slightly franker and tougher tone about some of the things that we see. But at the end of the day, we don't want to push Turkey away. We do need cooperation. I mean, I learned a very important lesson. I criticized Europe for its borders policy. And, you know, it was vital, that deal that was done between the European Union and Turkey, to stop the flow of refugees. And we need a partnership in order to do that. We also do need firmer borders. I mean, one of the interesting lessons I drew from that period was that while people were crossing from Turkey to Greece and able to just travel into Europe, because the Greeks, to be frank, weren't really worried about it because no one was staying in Greece, we had no solution. And although people don't want to see walls and barbed wire and all the rest of it, actually it was the moment when the Macedonians effectively erected something of a fence and Greece started to fill up that the Greek government thought, really, we've got to do something about this. And I was very struck visiting Bulgaria, which of course has both a land and a sea border with Turkey. They never had such a problem of migrants coming through that border. They always had relations with Turkey. They had firm borders. You do need, I'm not saying Donald Trump's right to build a wall the whole way across Texas, but you do need to have firm borders. That is part of the security we need. So firm borders and good relations. But I think a slightly more frank dialogue with Turkey about some of the things, some of the trends that we disagree with.
Yep, yep. Well, I think thanks to Mr. Trump, Europe seems to be willing finally to invest more in NATO.
Yes.
So that's a good thing, especially in an increasingly more VUCA world, more volatile, more uncertain, more complex. But it's not an easy thing to do. I think in Holland we just spent €4.5 billion to buy 37 Joint Strike Fighters while entering the era of drones. So it's hard for today's generals to foretell how future warfare is going to look like. How do you see NATO develop?
Well, I think, look, it's not often I say Donald Trump is absolutely right, but this sentence does begin, Donald Trump is absolutely right, which is he's absolutely right that Europe needs to spend more on its defense. We have been, you know, lucky to have the huge support of the United States, huge defense spending by the United States. But it is, you know, a scandal, frankly, that there are only a very small handful of countries in Europe that reach the 2% of GDP on defense spending. And I'm proud to say that Britain is one of them. Another is Greece, but that's mostly because of concerns about Turkey rather than spending on NATO. I think Poland is now getting there. But the big countries whose 2% will make a real difference, particularly Germany, have not been doing it. And it's not fair to America to have to share that burden, but also we should ask ourselves, is 2% of your GDP too much to spend on the vital issue of defense? In a world where you've got Russia flexing its muscles, including in European countries like Ukraine, in a world where we have Islamist extremists setting off bombs, maiming and killing hundreds in our own cities, where you've got a deeply unstable world, where we know we can't walk on by, as I explained earlier, is 2% really too much? So I think, you know, I applaud the decision to buy the Joint Strike Fighters, and it's absolutely right. We will need more of the drone technology. I can tell you as Prime Minister, sitting there round the cabinet table, round the National Security Council table, it was very rare that I was thinking, if only we had some more tanks in Germany. Always it was, we need more drone capacity, we need more intelligence and oversight capacity, we need more mobility, we need more special forces. I mean, so many of the things that we're trying to do today is actually about being able to move very quickly, to move very stealthily, and to have that sort of technology that gives us the edge over our adversaries. So I think 2% is not too much to ask. I think Trump is right to ask for it, and I think European politicians need to stand up and be counted and spend the money.
What you're actually telling us that freedom comes at a cost.
Yeah, well, we've seen in this continent, you know, twice in the last century, the disaster of global war. We've seen the results of weakness. We saw it before the Second World War, weak defenses, appeasing aggressors. So we've seen it with Putin. You know, I think you can draw an absolutely straight line between Georgia and Ukraine. So I think we should have learned that lesson. I'd also say, though, that as Prime Minister, often you would find the tool that you wanted as you sat around the National Security Council table wasn't always a military one. And that's why we were the first G8 country to spend 0.7% of our national income on overseas development and aid. And so often it was that you wanted to reach for. You know, when you've got these huge migration crises in Africa, yes, of course, there's a role to be done in training troops and helping with borders and what have you, but actually what you need is aid and assistance to help these countries grow and actually provide jobs for their young people so they don't feel they're going to move halfway across the world. And I thought in terms of Britain's power and influence, often the aid budget, whether you were helping with typhoons in the Philippines or crises in Haiti, or whether you were trying to help these African countries with you know, mass movement of people, actually the aid budget is a very important part of your power and your projection, as well as being a morally good thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the Far East. In August, I visited Seoul and the North Korean border, and I realized more than ever that this part of the world is still one of the most dangerous places on the planet. How do you see geopolitical developments in this part of the world?
Well, I was there the other day. I don't know whether you did this, but I had a little bit of spare time. And so I rented a bicycle, and I bicycled all the way along the river through the center of Seoul. And every now and again, they have these public address systems because you're so close to the demilitarized zone. And every now and again, something comes out over the loudspeakers. And you've no idea, of course, if you don't speak Korean, they could have been saying, you know, remember to put on factor 20 sun cream, or, you know, the bombs start raining down in 10 minutes. You have no idea which one it is. Look, I think we're looking at a better situation. It's been an extraordinary combination, actually. I mean, I think Trump will probably get quite a lot of the credit, but actually I think it's a combination of things. I think the sanctions have been far stronger. I think the Chinese have altered their calculus, because they've always thought we'd rather have the crazy guy in North Korea than have a unified Korea and troops on the Chinese border. And the other thing is that the South Koreans elected a conciliator. And I think it's those three things together, plus Trump's willingness to take some risks and meet the person he had previously, in Elton John terms, described as Rocket Man. I think those things coming together helped to bring about what I don't think we're necessarily going to see denuclearization of North Korea, but we could see a radical coming down in tensions, and that I think would be a good thing. But I think it's the Chinese have changed their approach. They became more and more worried that these nuclear tests were affecting them, that the dangers North Korea posed with such a dangerous leader was actually a risk to them, and I think they've changed their view slightly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have the same vision here. You're talking China. Let's move to China. Pollution is a big thing there. I think President Xi Jinping promised China's continued commitment to the Paris Climate Accords. He delivered a strong defense for open free trade. Are his pledges contradictions to China's actual policies, or do you see a more progressive China emerging here?
It's a very good question. I think, I mean, I hope what he says on climate change and renewable energy is going to be reflected in policy, and I think there's some good signs. They're now massive investors in green energy, massive investors in wind power, and all the rest of it. But I think the opportunity for us, for the West, is to take him at his word. That speech he made in Davos, where he said he wants to stand up for free trade and the liberal international order, where he wants to stand up for international action on climate change, we should say, great, let's hold China to these pledges and promises. I mean, my whole approach to China was that the idea you can try and frustrate or confront the rise of China as a great power is a total fiction. The rise of China is a fact. It is happening. It's the biggest change in the global economy in our lifetimes. And I think the task for us is to try and bind China into a world of institutions and rules and norms so that China can rise peacefully. And so it was the biggest row I ever had with President Obama, where China wanted to establish a new international body, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we decided to be founder members and join. And Obama was furious that Britain had broken with America over this. But I thought it's unsustainable to say to China, join the IMF, join the WTO, join the United Nations, take part in these bodies, but if you want to set up something that is a genuine international body, we're not going to play any part in it. And I think I've been proved right because we are playing a part in it, and its rules and its governance make it as good as any other multilateral body. So engage them, get them involved in these. We're never going to agree about, we are multi-party democracies, they're a one-party state, but we can try and make the rise of China safe. I did perhaps take it to one degree too great when he came to stay, Xi Jinping came to stay at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. And I thought, what should I do to show how strong our relationship is? And they wanted to show what a man of the people he is. So I took him down the pub. And we sat there, and the Chinese were so excited by this. Normally when two politicians go down the pub, the cameras are on for a couple of minutes. They film something, and then they push off. The cameras are on for half an hour for us drinking beer and eating fish and chips. The result was that the beer sold out in China the next day. And then the next thing that happened is that a Chinese company came along and bought the pub. And the last I heard, they're actually planning to roll out the Prime Minister's pub all across China. I foolishly didn't get any equity in this deal, but I hope it happens. At least they'll get some decent British beer. It'll be good for them.
Amazing story. Thanks for sharing. Let's talk a little bit about the future. We all here, we want peace and prosperity in Europe. We need leadership that provides clarity, direction, and commitment. And you've shown us that you're capable of doing that. You're 51 years old.
52 next week.
52 next week, okay. Still full of strength, lots of energy, passion. The world needs you. The world needs you. What's your plan for the future?
Well, right, look, I think it's a huge honor to serve your country for 6 years and lead a party for 11 years. I felt I had to resign because I didn't fight the referendum campaign on the basis of here's a decision on the one hand, on the other hand. I fought it 100% on one side. I threw everything I had into that argument. And I just don't think I would have had the credibility to lead the country having run that campaign. And I think we needed someone else to take the country forward and make these decisions. So I think it was right to resign. And when you resign, you have to stand back. Being Prime Minister is hard enough without having your predecessor give a running commentary on how you're doing. So I think I asked George Bush about this. I said, Mr. President, what's your advice on leaving office? And he said, say nothing. And I said, what do you mean, literally nothing? He said, literally nothing. He said, you either succeed by comparison or you fail by comparison. And right now with Donald Trump, I'm doing great. I'm not making that argument myself. So I think you have to shut up and go away. You have to let your successor get on with it. I'm spending time, as was said, I'm president of this big Alzheimer's charity. One of the things I did in office was we doubled the research budget into dementia. We made it a feature of the G8. I actually think, whereas with cancer, if it's a marathon, with cancer, we're in the last 4 or 5 miles. With dementia, we're probably in mile 2 or 3. We'll get to the end of it. We will win. We will find a treatment. We'll find, if you like, I expect a number of people here take statins to stop you having heart. We'll find statins for the brain. That's what we'll find. But it's going to take a lot of science, a lot of research, a lot of philanthropy, and the pharmaceutical companies are not going to do it themselves because we're too far away from the end goal. So I think it's a really positive thing for a former Prime Minister to do is to get stuck into raising the money, bringing the world together on that. So that's a big focus of mine. As I said, I'm doing some other charitable things. I'm doing a few business things, writing a book. So I've got plenty, and I'm a bit of a better father. I'm doing the pancakes every morning before school, which I didn't always get to do in the past. But look, I, as you say, I'm 51. I don't know what I'll be doing in 2 or 3 years' time. I don't rule anything out. I love public service. I love serving my country. I care passionately about these issues. So who knows what opportunities could come about. I think in politics, people tend now to want the next new thing rather than the past old thing. But there may be other ways to make a contribution.
David, thank you so much for sharing and being that open with us. And we really very much appreciated that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Cameron, give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.